Like any good Hoyoverse game, Honkai Star Rail has a way for players to choose a free 5-star character. We all know about the standard banner selector that you get upon doing 300 standard pulls, but between versions 2.7 and 3.2, every player will be able to select another free standard 5-star character. Early in Star Rail's life, I made a video talking about which 5-star to pick, but so much has changed over the past year and a half. So today, we're going to go over each of these 7 standard 5-star characters to see how valuable they are in the present day, along with talking about some of their eidolons as well. And then I'm going to rank them based on how good of a choice I think that they are, to show you all which characters I think are going to be the best overall picks for your account. First, let's start with Bailu. Bailu is a lightning abundance character whose gameplay focuses on raw healing. The biggest benefits of Bailu are her survivability, with her healing, team-wide damage reduction, and once per battle revive. In theory, she could be SP positive, but in practice, especially with the more current content, she tends to lean more towards being SP neutral. This is because of the way her ultimate works, which not only will heal the entire team, but will also apply her invigoration status for 2 turns. Invigoration will not only give 10% damage reduction, but it will also allow characters to restore a percentage of Bailu's max HP upon being attacked. That effect can only trigger up to 3 times, but this could be a great way for you to have some extra survivability, as Bailu herself runs a lot of HP. Also in the department of eidolons, Bailu also has a strong E1 and E2, and both of them are ways for her to get more energy and also get some more outgoing healing respectively. But that's pretty much where Bailu's pros end, as she has 2 really big weaknesses in her kit. The first is that she does not have a cleanse, meaning that teams running her will have no counterplay against enemy debuffs. And considering how many enemies nowadays have debuffs attached to them, whether it's dot, crowd control, or anything else that is considered a debuff, it really isn't great to run Bailu in those situations. So that really makes Bailu a not so great option in a lot of content already. The second weakness of Bailu is that despite how good her survivability looks, she is a victim of power creep. And not only do several better options exist, there are even sustains that are more accessible, being 4 stars, that are either performing at a similar level, if not outright better. Those examples mainly being Lynx, who is permanently free, and we also have Gallagher, who has been occasionally free through events. So just because of that, there are so many better options than Bailu, and she honestly is not really cutting it in the present day. Next, let's talk about Bronya, who is a Wind Harmony character whose gameplay focuses on buffing a single ally significantly. At launch, many people, as well as myself, considered Bronya to be the best standard banner character, and over time she has definitely retained some of that value. Her skill and ultimate are her sources of buffs, and each of them provide different stat buffs to maximize a single DPS's power, and it's really important that she gives different buffs with each of them, because you're not going to experience diminishing returns, so different stats in the overall damage equation are going to be buffed from Bronya. Starting with her skill, it will buff an ally's damage for 1 turn, as well as guaranteed cleanse a debuff from them, and also bring them to the top of the action order, which by itself is a very powerful ability. But her ultimate will also increase all allies' attack, as well as their crit damage by a percentage of Bronya's own crit damage, making her a very capable buffer for hypercarry teams. Bronya's E1 is also very valuable, as it gives a 50% chance to recover 1 skill point each time Bronya uses her skill, which is really good because you pretty much always want to use Bronya's skill so that you're always buffing your main DPS. So from what I've mentioned about Bronya so far, the benefits of her and also getting her eidolon seems to be pretty obvious, but now that she's been out since the start of the game, I do think she shares a similar situation as other characters that released in version 1.0, is that there are better options, but Bronya doesn't suffer from power creep nearly as much as some of the other characters that we have yet to talk about. And I think for Bronya, her biggest issue is just the fact that hypercarry itself as a concept is not the same as it once was. Back in 1.0, a lot of the teams that we ran were like a main DPS and then 2 harmony supports and then a sustain. But once we moved on to 2.0, Honkai Star Rail has turned more into a game about team archetypes rather than just like, oh, here's a regular DPS, you just buff them with whatever the best harmony supports you have are. Now we have like break archetypes, we have follow-up archetypes. And because of that, and because Bronya doesn't adhere to a specific archetype, a lot of the time there are just going to be better characters to use than Bronya, which really just makes her a really good character when it comes to someone who doesn't have a lot of options. But if you do have a lot of these like really good, archetype specific supports like Robin, Ron, Mei, and so on, then Bronya is going to have less value for you overall. But even still, Bronya does still remain a very solid character, and if they do release characters that kind of nod back to the original like hyper carry that we had back in 1.0, then Bronya can still see some value there as well. Now let's talk about Clara, who has been the most consistent in my opinion in terms of their place in the meta. Clara is a physical destruction character whose gameplay focuses on getting hit to deal counterattacks. When using Clara, you'll want to maximize her chances of being hit, her damage, and her survivability, which is why her ultimate is amazing for her kit. It gives her 25% damage reduction for 2 turns, it greatly increases her chance of being attacked for those 2 turns, and enhances the damage of her counters, as well as making her counters go from a single target attack to a blast attack, which is going to result in even more damage as well. Clara's talent not only has the pretty solid damage multiplier for her counters, but it also gives her an unconditional 10% damage reduction against enemies that attack her. Enemies who attack Clara are also inflicted with the Mark of Counter, and this Mark of Counter also makes Clara's E1 an insanely good investment. At E0, when you use Clara's skill on an enemy, it will deal extra damage to that enemy, but at the cost of removing Mark of Counter. But if you have E1 on Clara, you will no longer remove Mark of Counter, meaning that after the first time that you deal a counter attack to an enemy, Clara is going to be able to deal double damage with her skill for the rest of the fight, which is a really big increase of damage overall. Outside of that, Clara's other Eidolons will either contribute to her damage or her survivability, which no matter what you have your Clara at, whether you don't have her, whether she's E1, whether she's like E4, all of her Eidolons are going to have a pretty decent amount of value for her, so her vertical investment is pretty decent overall. Now, when it comes to the downsides of Clara, there honestly aren't any, but the one thing that I know a lot of people are thinking about is the existence of Yanli. Now, Yanli is basically the exact same playstyle, well, I shouldn't say exact same, but pretty similar to Clara in the fact that she's also a character that wants to get hit, deal counterattacks, and obviously Yanli's going to be doing more damage since she's a more limited version of that playstyle. But unlike a lot of other times, not just in Star Rail but in gacha games, where a character that is meant to replace another character just completely does that, Clara can still hold her own and do very well in endgame. It's mainly going to be pure fiction, at least from my experience, but the fact that Clara can still hold her own in at least one of the endgame modes is definitely telling, especially for a character who was a day 1 release. So yeah, despite Yanli being just better than Clara in terms of damage and all that, Clara is still pretty valuable and has definitely saved me in pure fiction on numerous occasions. Next up, we have everyone's favorite character, Yanqing. He is an ice hunt character, and his kit makes him very easy to build. This is because of his talent, which describes the Soul Steal Sync status he gets for 1 turn upon using his skill. Soul Steal Sync gives Yanqing 20% crit rate and 30% crit damage, as well as a 60% chance to do a follow-up attack when he attacks an enemy. This follow-up attack also has a 65% chance to freeze. In addition to this, Yanqing's ultimate gives him an additional 60% crit rate and 50% crit damage for 1 turn when Soul Steal Sync is active. So pairing this with his talent makes it much easier to build him, as he doesn't need as much crit rate and crit damage to achieve a good crit ratio. Yanqing also has several really solid Eidolons that buff his damage, as well as also his E2, which will increase his energy regen by 10%, while Soul Steel Sync is active. Now I know what you might be thinking, this Soul Steel Sync sounds pretty good, Yanqing must be a pretty solid character. But Soul Steel Sync has one fatal flaw, which is that Yanqing will lose all of the effects of it upon taking damage. And because there are only very few shielders in the game, which are the only characters that can fully make Yanqing not take damage, his performance ends up being extremely inconsistent, since even the smallest amount of damage from the enemy will strip him of all these amazing crit buffs that he gets in his kit. Not only that, but the only way to reapply Soul Steel Sync is after using his skill, meaning that if you get hit with Yanqing, the next skill you do, the damage is gonna honestly suck, and it really just is not worth it. Plus, not to mention that over the course of Star Rail's life, honestly pretty early on in Star Rail 2, after probably the first few updates, we've really progressed from the single target fights that Yanqing would thrive in to more multi-targeted fights throughout the entire game. Even in modes like Memory of Chaos and Apocalyptic Shadow, a lot of the time you are fighting 3 to 5 enemies. And of course Pure Fiction, especially with the upcoming update, we're going to be fighting 5 enemies regardless. So because of that, Yanqing just doesn't have a place where he's going to be able to perform well, and also DPS power creep being as crazy as it is, Yanqing is really just left in the dust. Now moving on to Welt, he is by far the most unique case of the bunch. He is an imaginary Nihility character who has seen success as both a sub DPS and a debuffer. His gameplay focuses on delaying the actions of his enemies through his skill and ultimate. His skill damages one enemy and 2 random enemies, with each hit having a 75% base chance of lowering the attacked enemy's speed by 10% for 2 turns. Welt's ultimate is even better when it comes to delaying enemies, as it has a 100% base chance to imprison all enemies for 1 turn. Imprisoned enemies have their action delayed by 40%, as well as their speed lowered by 10%. Welt is also able to not only deal more personal damage to slowed enemies through his talent and A6 trace, but he can also increase the team's overall damage to enemies when he hits them with his ultimate for 2 turns. Welt also has some insanely strong early Eidolons, with his E1 buffing his basic attack and skill damage for 2 turns after his ultimate, while his E2 will give him 3 energy each time he activates that extra damage from his talent. Now with all that in mind, you might be wondering why I said Welt is a unique case for these standard 5 stars. Well, that's going to be because while he's nowhere near the best Nihility in the game and not a character that's even on the forefront of people's minds, at the same time he's also not completely irrelevant. And it's not a Bronya situation where it's we know what will make Welt be we know what will make Bronya be an amazing character. Welt is just kind of I almost feel like he's a potential man in the fact that he has a ton of potential with delaying enemies, but I feel like we really need a character that will not only benefit from delayed enemies a lot, or more than your average character does, but also a character that's going to want Nihility characters as opposed to the really strong Harmony characters that we have in the game. Now, since Welt already does have some pretty solid vertical investment, as well with his Eidolons, plus also just generally being a kind of flexible character in the fact that he can either be just a raw debuffer or he can be a sub DPS, I think his potential is pretty solid, so it definitely doesn't hurt to get Welt, especially if you have a good investment on the standard characters that are better than him. For our second to last standard character, we have Gepard, who is an ice preservation character whose gameplay focuses on keeping shields up for the team. He applies his shields by using his ultimate, and they scale off of his high defense. The shields last for 3 turns, so considering that his ultimate cost is only 100, and he also has a higher chance of getting hit, it is very possible to have a 100% uptime on his shields. Also, because he can only apply shields from his ultimate, you can actually choose to either use his skill for a chance to apply freeze on a single enemy, or just stick to using his basic attack for a more SP positive playstyle. Gepard's technique also applies a weaker shield for 2 turns, which is enough time to get his ultimate up, especially since in the endgame you do start out with half your energy gauge already. So because of how consistent Gepard's shields can be, he is a very solid character at E0 and not having any vertical investment. But what I will say is, while he does suffer from a similar issue, though not as bad as Bailu, in the fact that there are better sustains. For one, preservation doesn't have as much competition overall, and Gepard can still hold his own more so in the later game content. But I think the only thing that really holds Gepard back from a selector like this is the fact that of the standard 5 stars, I think it's pretty safe to say he has the worst vertical investment I have ever seen. Because his Eidolons really don't do anything for his defense, which is what you're going to want from a character that's trying to shield his allies, and whose main, gameplay is applying these shields. The only Eidolon he has that has somewhat of an impact on his sustain is his E4, which will give a team-wide 20% effect res buff when his shields are up. But that doesn't even really do much for the actual duration and overall strength of his shields, which is really what you would want from a character whose literal main gameplay is his shields. So I do think that when it comes to Gepard, he is really only a valuable pickup if you don't have him at all. But once you do have him, those Eidolons really are not necessary at all. Lastly, let's talk about Himeko, who is a fire erudition character. Her gameplay focuses on activating her follow-up attack as much as possible to deal damage. To activate Himeko's follow-up attack, she needs to accumulate 3 points of charge, and she obtains 1 point at the start of battle, and she also obtains 1 point when an enemy is weakness broken. Outside of her allies, Himeko will mostly use her skill and ultimate to damage enemy toughness, as her skill is a blast attack and her ultimate is an AoE that will also restore 5 energy per enemy it defeats. When it comes to Eidolons, Himeko is honestly the opposite of Gepard, as she has some of the best vertical investment compared to the other standard characters. The most notable ones are her E1, which will increase her speed for 2 turns after her follow-up attack activates, her E2, which allows her to deal extra damage to enemies who have below half HP, and her E4, which will give Himeko an extra charge when she herself breaks an enemy's toughness. Comparing my opinion of Himeko early in Star Rail versus now is like night and day, which is very rare for a character in a gacha game, because you typically expect a character to go down in value, but Himeko has honestly gone up. And that's really because not only of the release of Pure Fiction, but also with the upcoming revamp, where there's always going to be 5 enemies, Himeko has become an absolute staple character for that mode, regardless of other erudition characters releasing even after Pure Fiction came out, and also right before with Argenti. And honestly, because she's good in Pure Fiction, I do think that that gives her a ton of value, especially since she is one of those characters that can just kind of burst through, or you can kind of just put on auto and not really have to worry if you have a pretty well-built Himeko. So that's everything for my individual character reviews for these standard characters. So now we're going to talk about who I think you should select. And I did mention that I'm going to rank them based on how high of a priority they are for you to select. And really, I'm doing that because every account, especially with a game that is a year and a half old, I definitely think every account is going to be in a different place. Some people might be missing like half the standard roster, even if they've been playing for a while. Some people might have all the characters with no Eidolons. So because everyone's situation is different, I want to rank it so that if I say that a character is the most valuable and you already have them with like a lot of Eidolons, then maybe a character that is slightly lower in the ranking might be a better fit for your account overall. And again, like I said, these are just my opinions, so it's not going to be that deep if you disagree with me. So, starting at the bottom here with number 7, I have Bailu. As much as I was a defender of this character in the very early days of Star Rail, she's fallen off way too much for me to recommend her here pretty much at all. Her Eidolons don't give her enough of a boost for players who already have her. Plus, every player can also get links for free upon clearing Pure Fiction for the first time, and that's also a permanent free character. It's not event gated, it's not time limited, you can get links whenever you're able to challenge Pure Fiction. And Lynx is either pretty comparable, if not slightly better than Bailu because of the utility she provides. Plus you also have several other sustain options as well that are going to really outperform Bailu by an insane amount. At number 6, I have Yanqing, simply because outside of teams with insanely strong shields or amazing RNG, his performance will be pretty inconsistent and nowhere near as good as any other 5-star DPS in the game. Now I do give him his flowers a little bit, because I think if you are an extremely early game player, since especially for the version 2.7 free 5-star, there shouldn't be any kind of criteria for you to get the Selector outside of having your mail active. I think that if you're an early game player and you just want a quick DPS that you don't have to invest in too much for the very early game, Yanqing can be good, but outside of that, it's just going to be better to invest in other characters. At number 5, I have Welt. Like I mentioned in his section, he's not bad by any means, but unlike the others that are above him, he doesn't or hasn't even really had a place where you're yeah, Welt is honestly that guy on this comp. He's someone that you can kind of just slot in, see how he performs. He definitely has synergy with some characters, but I think he's a character that we'll have to see if they release a character that will really mesh with his kit super well, but he definitely is not a bad pickup, especially with how good his Eidolons are, and also just how generally good action delay is as a concept. And he really is the only character that goes into action delay a lot with his kit. At number 4, I have Gepard. He's a character that just really gets his job done and does it well, but the thing that's really holding it back is the lack of vertical investment and the lack of potential from his Eidolons, because they really aren't helping his main core purpose. But if you do want to get Gepard as your very first copy of him, he is absolutely a really solid pickup for sure. But if you have Gepard, I think he goes way lower on the list when it comes to priority. At number 3, I have Bronya. She's definitely fallen from grace due to power creep in the game's abandonment of the type of hyper carry that she excelled in back in 1.0, but her action advance and buffs make her a very strong option on several teams, especially if you lack some of the limited harmony characters and you just need an extra buffer. At number 2, I have Clara, simply because she is a very powerful character for the endgame, especially if you have characters around her that can both support her and also keep her alive to fuel her counter-focused playstyle to your advantage. And considering that she can do some work in a decent amount of the pure fictions, that is very valuable in itself. And finally, at the number 1 spot, I have Himeko. Not only does Himeko have amazing vertical investment potential compared to the other standard characters, but I also expect her to continue to be an absolute staple for pure fiction in the foreseeable future. And unlike Clara, who has been good in some pure fictions here and there, Himeko I don't think has been bad in a single pure fiction, regardless if it's follow-up based, if it's dot based, if it's ultimate based. I've used Himeko in pretty much every pure fiction, and she has absolutely helped me. Despite the fact that I have her at E0, I don't have the most investment in her, but her build is decent. And just because of that, and also the fact that for all of the standard characters, or for most of the standard characters, there isn't really an endgame mode that many of them will super excel in. Himeko is the only character that absolutely excels in an endgame mode, and I think that in itself is extremely valuable. So that is why I have Himeko as my overall top pick. So that is my overall analysis on which standard 5-star character you should go with. I'd really love to see who you all are going to pick in the comments below. Thank you all so much for watching, and if you enjoyed and want to see more content from me, be sure to hit that subscribe button. But with that, I will see you all next time.